For decades, the Linux desktop lived in a strange space where it was simultaneously powerful and invisible, loved deeply by its users yet ignored by the mainstream, always described as almost there but never quite arriving. But here we are in 2026, and when you look at the Linux desktop today, it feels genuinely unrecognizable compared to what most people imagined even 5 years ago. This isn't the Linux of confusing installers, broken Wi-Fi drivers, endless terminal commands, and forums telling you to recompile your kernel. This is something entirely different, something polished, cohesive, and shockingly normal. The question now isn't whether Linux can compete anymore, but whether the battle it was fighting even exists in the same way. And that leads us to the real question behind all of this. Did Linux finally win, or did the definition of winning itself change? To understand why 2026 feels like such a turning point, you have to remember where Linux desktop came from. For most of its history, Linux wasn't designed with everyday users in mind. It was built by developers for developers, by sysadmins for servers, and by enthusiasts who valued control over comfort. The desktop was almost an afterthought, something layered on top of a powerful core that assumed you knew what you were doing. That philosophy created incredible flexibility, but also enormous friction. Installing Linux often meant choosing between dozens of distros with unclear differences, wrestling with hardware compatibility, and learning workflows that felt hostile if you were coming from Windows or Mac. For years, Linux users wore this difficulty like a badge of honor, but it also kept Linux locked out of the mainstream. Fast forward to 2026, and that mindset has quietly faded away. Modern Linux desktops feel intentional in a way they never did before. Distributions now ship with coherent design systems, consistent default apps, and onboarding experiences that assume the user may have never touched Linux in their life. You boot into the desktop, and it just works. Wi-Fi connects instantly, Bluetooth headphones pair without drama, touchpads behave exactly how you expect, and high DPI displays scale correctly out of the box. These sound like small things, but for Linux, they represent a philosophical shift. The priority is no longer just freedom and configurability, but trust. The system is expected to be reliable, predictable, and boring in the best possible way. One of the most striking changes is how polished Linux desktops look now. In 2026, the visual gap between Linux and proprietary systems has completely vanished. No aim feels refined, fluid, and modern, with animations that are smooth even on modest hardware. KDE Plasma, once criticized for being overwhelming, has matured into an incredibly sleek and customizable environment that still manages to feel coherent. Even lightweight desktops have adopted better design principles, offering clean layouts and sensible defaults instead of looking like relics from another era. The idea that Linux looks ugly or amateurish simply doesn't hold up anymore. In many cases, it actually looks more elegant and consistent than what you get from Windows. But this isn't just about visuals. Under the surface, the Linux desktop in 2026 is radically different because of how software is distributed and managed. Traditional package managers are still there, but they're no longer the center of the experience for most users. Universal packaging formats have finally reached maturity, and whether you personally love or hate them, their impact is undeniable. Installing apps no longer feels like a gamble between outdated repositories and broken dependencies. You search, you click install, and the app works exactly as expected. Updates happen in the background without breaking your system, and rollback features mean a bad update is no longer a nightmare scenario. This has removed one of the biggest historical pain points of Linux for casual users. Another massive shift is how Linux interacts with hardware. In the past, Linux users often had to research laptops and components like they were planning a scientific experiment, carefully choosing models known to work well. In 2026, that burden has largely disappeared. Hardware vendors are quietly supporting Linux at a level that would have seemed impossible years ago. Drivers are upstreamed faster, firmware updates are delivered seamlessly, and modern laptops ship with Linux compatibility as a given rather than an exception. This isn't always advertised loudly, but it's happening driven by the fact that Linux now powers everything from servers to developer machines to consumer devices behind the scenes. Supporting Linux simply makes business sense. Gaming, once the Achilles heel of the Linux desktop, has undergone one of the most dramatic transformations of all. In 2026, the idea that Linux can't play games feels outdated, thanks to years of compatibility layers, native ports, and platform-level investment. The vast majority of popular games now run flawlessly on Linux, often with performance that matches or even exceeds Windows. Anti-cheat once a near insurmountable barrier, is no longer the universal blocker it used to be. While not every single title works perfectly, the experience is good enough that many gamers have stopped caring about the underlying operating system entirely. They install their launcher, download their games, and play. That alone represents a massive psychological shift. Professional workflows tell a similar story. In the past, Linux desktops were often dismissed because real work required proprietary software that only ran on Windows or macOS. In 2026, that argument feels weaker than ever. Creative tools, development environments, and productivity apps are increasingly cross-platform or web. Where native Linux versions don't exist, compatibility layers and containerized environments fill the gaps surprisingly well. For developers, Linux has effectively become the default desktop, offering an environment that mirrors production systems while still feeling comfortable and modern. Even non-technical professionals are finding that Linux no longer limits their options in any meaningful way. What's particularly interesting is how Linux's rise hasn't come from aggressive marketing or a single killer distro. Instead, it's been a slow, almost accidental victory. Linux didn't win by convincing everyone to abandon Windows overnight. It won by becoming unavoidable. Linux runs the cloud, powers containers, underpins Android, and drives the infrastructure of the modern internet. As more people interact with Linux indirectly, the idea of using it directly on the desktop stops feeling strange. In 2026, Linux feels familiar even to people who have never consciously used it before. At the same time, the competition has changed. Windows and macOS aren't standing still, but they've also evolved in ways that ironically push users toward Linux, increasing hardware requirements. Mandatory online accounts, aggressive telemetry, subscription models, and lockdown ecosystems have left many users feeling uneasy. Linux, by contrast, offers an escape hatch. It represents ownership in a world increasingly defined by rentals. You install it, you control it, and it doesn't constantly remind you that you're part of someone else's platform. That philosophical difference resonates more strongly now than it ever did in the past. However, it would be dishonest to claim that Linux has completely conquered the desktop in a traditional market share sense. In 2026, most consumer PCs still ship with Windows, and macOS remains dominant in certain creative and professional circles. But the old metric of desktop market share feels less relevant than it once did. The real question is influence, not percentage points. Linux has shaped how modern operating systems work. From package management ideas to containerization to system architecture, even Windows now borrows heavily from concepts that originated in the Linux world. In that sense, Linux won a long time ago, even if few people noticed. What makes 2026 feel special is that Linux desktop is no longer a compromise. In the past, choosing Linux often meant accepting trade. You gained control and stability, but you lost convenience or compatibility. Today, those trade-offs are minimal or non-existent for most users. You can choose Linux simply because you like it, not because you're willing to endure it. That psychological shift is enormous. When an operating system stops being a statement and starts being a default option, that's when you know something fundamental has changed. There's also a cultural shift within the Linux community itself. The endless distro wars, the elitism around terminal usage, and the hostility toward newcomers have solved. In 2026, the dominant attitude is pragmatic rather than ideological. The goal is to make Linux usable, approachable, and sustainable. That doesn't mean Linux has lost its identity or its values. It means those values are being expressed through better design and better user experience, rather than through complexity for its own sake. So did Linux finally win? The answer depends on what winning means. If winning means replacing Windows on every consumer desktop, then no, not yet, and maybe never. But if winning means proving that a free, open, community-driven operating system can deliver a world-class desktop experience, then the answer is clearly yes. Linux in 2026 is unrecognizable because it no longer feels like the underdog. It feels confident, mature, and complete. In many ways, Linux didn't just catch up. It changed the race. The modern desktop isn't about flashy features or proprietary lock-in anymore. It's about stability, privacy, flexibility, and long-term trust. Linux aligns naturally with those values, especially in a world where users are increasingly skeptical of platforms that treat them as products. The fact that Linux offers all of this without asking for subscriptions, mandatory accounts, or constant surveillance is not a minor detail. It's a core advantage Perhaps the most telling sign of Linux's success is how little noise it makes about it. There's no grandiose announcement declaring victory, no marketing campaign shouting that Linux has arrived. Instead, people quietly install it, use it, and forget about it, which is exactly what most people want from an operating system. It fades into the background and lets them get on with their lives. For something that once demanded constant attention and troubleshooting, that's the ultimate transformation. In 2026, the Linux desktop feels less like a rebellion and more like a foundation. It's stable, adaptable, and ready for whatever comes next. Whether the future involves new hardware form factors, deeper AI integration, or entirely new ways of interacting with computers, Linux is already there, flexible enough to adapt without being rewritten from scratch. That resilience is something proprietary systems struggle to match. So when you look at the Linux desktop today and compare it to its past, unrecognizable is exactly the right word. Not because it abandoned its roots, but because it finally grew into them. It learned how to be powerful without being painful, free without being fragmented, and customizable without being chaotic. In that sense, Linux didn't just win a war against other operating systems. It won a long internal battle to define what it wanted to be. And maybe that's the real victory. Not dominance, not market share, but relevance. Linux in 2026 is relevant to normal users, to professionals, to gamers, to creators, and to anyone who wants an operating system that respects them. It's no longer a question of whether Linux is ready for the desktop. The desktop is ready for Linux, and it has been for a while now.